I was a college professor for a long time. It's really hard to not go on and on. So I'm just trying to be mindful. So John of the Cross, I hadn't yet realized when I encountered John of the Cross, I was 20. And I was studying Spanish. It was my junior year in college, and I was studying Spanish literature in Spain. I did a semester abroad, lived with a family. I had already spent a lot of time traveling with my hippie family in the Yucatan in the early 70s. Anybody else on the caravan ride in the early 70s through the Yucatan? It seemed to have been a thing. You missed it. Sorry. It was fun. And so I'd learned some Spanish, but then there I was in Spain, 20 years old, living with the family, became fluent-ish in Spanish, enough to, pass the test of fluency. But I fell in love with Spanish poetry. And it was John of the Cross that really captivated me. And partly because he sounded to me, to my little 20-year-old Sufi ears, just like Rumi. In fact, he was using some of the identical imagery. A little aside? Okay. John of the Cross, actually, when he was around that age, no, probably even younger, he was very poor. He was born into a very poor family. Actually, his father's family was wealthy and privileged, probably Jewish, during 16th century Spain, but you had to hide your Jewish roots if you had them. Teresa of Avila also was born into a Jewish family, contemporary of John of the Cross, a little older, his guru, I think. But John of the Cross, when he was very young, very poor, so his father was privileged but had to renounce his family because he fell in love with this young Muslim weaver woman. And in order to be with her, he had to give up his fortune and his privilege, and he did. But he also died very young with four little boys, leaving his wife, the mother of his children, destitute. And she wandered with her children from village to village trying to peddle her wares. But the children were hungry. One of them died. One of his brothers died. And John of the Cross never made it above 5 feet, which I think is perfectly adequate. But I guess for a dude, it's a little different. He was very small. And he was on fire from a young age with love for God. But he somehow managed to land a position in a hospital where he worked in the ward for people who were dying, men who were dying of syphilis. And the administrator of the hospital, who was a Carmelite priest, took notice of this young man somehow. Maybe someone drew his attention, and he saw how incredibly compassionate he was with the people who were dying of syphilis, how present he was, how loving and how wise. At, I think he was 16 at this time. And the man said, I want to give you a scholarship to study at the University of Salamanca in northern Spain. Salamanca's in northern Spain, right? Which was the center of learning in Europe at the time. And so, this brings me back to the Rumi thing, circuitously. I haven't looked at my notes once. Are we okay? All right. I trust her. She's in charge. So the Holy Spirit / Shekhinah. So John of the Cross was exposed to all of the great mystical literature of the three Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It was right after the expulsion, just a few years later, when Jews and Muslims were expelled from Spain. And the fragrance of the convivencia, right, the confluence of the mystical streams of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that had dominated the Spanish consciousness for 700 years was still in the air. And John of the Cross was inhaling that at the University of Salamanca, and probably also literally studied Avicenna and Ibn Arabi and some of the great Sufi mystics. Judaism, mystical Judaism, Kabbalah had just emerged from that same landscape not long before. So you get the picture. So it's not an accident that the poetry of John of the Cross was steeped in the mystical wisdom of the three Abrahamic traditions. So I fell in love with fell in love with the poetry of John of the Cross in Spain and lived with it for many years before finally translating Dark Night of the Soul in my late 30s. It's because I had been teaching it. I was teaching philosophy and religious studies, and I'd been teaching John of the Cross, Dark Night of the Soul in particular, in translation. And my students, my basic intro to religious studies students, were so bored they were falling asleep. Unlike you guys who are so present. No, you really are. But they were falling asleep. And one of my colleagues, an English teacher, I was also a writer. I was a poet myself. I was writing fiction, pretty mediocre fiction, truth be told, but I loved writing. And he said, why don't you take your love of writing, your fluency in Spanish, and your passion for this text, Dark Night of the Soul, and bring them together and translate it. And I said, okay, so I did, and I'm going to read you something now. A paragraph from Dark Night of the Soul that I think is relevant.